Here's the question of the day. What do you do when you find Jesus? It's interesting. I've been preaching from this sort of idea for many years with regard to Christmas and the Nativity and the different things that we refer to it as. And Paul Mayer, who was a historian, archaeologist, had written a book called The First Christmas years ago. It's an old book. I still have it on a shelf somewhere, but I couldn't find it. But anyway, and he pretty much explained in that book the real context of Jesus' birth. I mean, historically, the shepherds, the star, the angels, the stable, the Bethlehem, all of that stuff. He kind of just sort of laid it out and said, what we create in a nativity scene, or there was one here, but I didn't put it back up because I'd have to take it right back down. So anyway, that whole picture, of a little wooden shelter, with some kind of star affixed in and around it, with a nice little. Y'all are going to hear me being sarcastic, and I don't really want you to hear that, but it's going to happen. With this slanted style little manger beer thing, that has hay in it and it's clean, with a probably an embroidered blanket or something on it, and then you got some shepherds who are standing off a little bit, and they've got a little lamb there, and you got Mary and Joseph in the manger, in the little wooden shelter there, and then you got three wise men standing on the outside carrying their little boxes, right? And we have this very sort of romanticized picture of the manger in Jesus' birth. And I'm just going to go ahead and tell you this morning, it wasn't like that. That's not the way it was. More than likely, the inn, as we refer to it, was not Hampton. Right? It was probably a sort of an adobe mud thatch roof looking house where people just slept in the corners. And they served a meal around rough-hewn board tables and that sort of thing. And when Mary and Joseph got to town, they knocked on a number of these buildings, these inns, so to speak. And we're told, no, there's no room in here. The place is packed. We can't fit another person inside. This crazy census thing that they've called for brought everybody home, and we can't get you in here. And yet the fulfillment of prophecy is taking place all along. Everything about Jesus and Mary and Joseph is fulfilling those prophetic passages of the prophets, the Old Testament, and everything that was said about the Messiah was being laid in and laid in and laid in, and stacking proof upon proof upon proof that Jesus is who He came to be, who He said He was, and everything that is God's fulfillment of that. And so when we romanticize it, can I just go ahead and say this? And this is gonna, when we romanticize things that in time are real and historical, we make it hard for unbelievers to believe. Okay? When we create this sort of mythology around real-time live events that happened historically that God brought about, we create this sort of fairy tale kind of image that unbelievers look at and go, yeah, you might as well believe in Mother Goose. So, what I wanted to do this morning is ask the question, what do we do? What to do when you find Jesus? And we're going to come from Matthew chapter 2, which is one of the normal Advent calendar Sunday messages about the wise men. And the wise men coming to find Jesus. And I'm going to start in verse 9, though I'll reference back to verse 1 in a minute. But and I didn't give you that, Amanda, so I'm sorry. But verse 9 says, after hearing the king, they went on their way. And there it was, the star they had seen at its rising. It led them until it came and stopped above the place where the child was. Now, I'll admit, we read that and we go, the star was moving somehow. Okay? I'll get to it in a minute. Just don't worry about it. Okay. When they saw the star, they were overwhelmed with joy. Entering the house, they saw the child with Mary, his mother, and falling to their knees, they worshiped him. Then they opened their treasures and presented him with gifts, gold, frankincense, and myrrh. You see, this was a real event. These wise men, some translations say magi. More than likely, they were astrologers from the Medo-Persian, Mesopotamian empire, that whole Persian culture. And more than likely, they were not kings, like our song says. More than likely, they were somehow revered as leaders in their culture and in the kingdom that they lived in, and were sought out for their wisdom and sort of the leadership that they saw by sort of, forgive me for using the word, but divining the messages from the stars, okay? And we have people do that today. It's you be careful. They'll send you one every day, tell you what your day's going to be like. So be careful. But anyway, so you got these wise men, right? These magi who came seeking, looking for Jesus. Why? Because they had seen something. Now, nobody, Paul Mayer in his book tries to explain. He said, it could have been this alignment that's supposed to happen today or tomorrow or something of two planets that presents itself in the heavens as a brighter body in the heavens that looks different from it ever has been in however many hundreds of years. But the planets had lined up and somehow that sort of conjunction of planets led them from the Medo-Persian, Mesopotamian river valley and brought them into Bethlehem because those planet stars lined up in a let's say a star body that represented the Jewish Hebrew people, and they knew that something happening in that group of stars means it's over in Jerusalem where the king of the Israel. And so they went to the king, and that's what it says. It says, after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea in the days of King Herod, wise men from the east arrived in Jerusalem, saying, where is he who has been born King of the Jews? For we saw his star at its rising and have come to worship him. So you see this thing that they had seen something in the heavens that provoked them. Okay? God spoke through the heavens. I can go ahead and just tell you, I don't know how he did it. I look up at stars and go, wow. I don't care what's going on up in the stars. I look up there and I go, wow. The other night, I guess there was some kind of meteor shower was going on because Eli went out the back door to take his dog out. And he came back in and he said, what's a shooting star look like? And I said, a bottle rocket without an explosion, right? And then it's gone. He said, something just went. I said, well, it could be that. It could be a satellite. It could be a number of things. I just read an article this week that says we got a lot of space junk out there, right? So we don't know what brought the wise men from, their home to seek out Jesus. But can I just go ahead and tell you, they didn't take Amtrak. So they started at some point, more than likely the birth of Jesus, and made the journey from somewhere in the Mesopotamian where Abraham came from, and they sort of made their way up the river valley and down to Jerusalem. So it took time. They probably came as a caravan like the one that Joseph was sold to that went into Egypt. And it was probably more than 3 people. It was probably a whole host of folks traveling, camels and donkeys and sheep and stuff. Right? And so they made their way to Jerusalem because Jerusalem's the capital. And if a king has somehow been registered in the stars, and every time I hear that commercial about naming a star for Christmas, y'all heard that commercial? Give the gift that lasts a lifetime. Name a star. And I think, God started that. right? He named that star after Jesus. All right. So anyway, that's just a side note. That's the way my brain works, and I apologize for it. But here you go. Something called them out of their home and sent them to Jerusalem. Something in the stars called them out of their home to go to Jerusalem. They went to Herod. Herod didn't know anything about it because Herod hadn't had any kids lately. So they call in well, after the wise men leave, he says, you go find him. So after hearing the king, they go to find him. The king calls in his wise men, his scribes and people, and says, what are these guys talking about? And the scribes of Hebrew, the Jews say, well, the prophecies say that the king will be born in Bethlehem. Well, that's an immediate threat to Herod's thing, right? All right, so let's just leave that on the shelf over there just a minute. And let's go back to the wise men. The wise men didn't have the prophets telling them what was going on. These are Medo-Persians that probably don't speak the language, right? So what do? They come back out of the palace and God's showing them the way. How did that look? I don't know. I can't tell you what the star looked like when it was leading them to Bethlehem, which is just a short journey from Jerusalem. But somehow in the stars, again, they were led to Bethlehem. And it says it stopped above the place where the child was. That's why we do manger scenes and put a big old star on top of it, because we just envision this idea that a star from the heavens just, zzz, boom, there it is. And can I just go ahead and tell you, it might have happened that way. Could God do it that way? Sure He could. God can do anything He wants to. Okay? So I don't know. I'm just going with the account here. When they saw the star, they were overwhelmed with joy. See, they had sort of run into a roadblock, right, at Jerusalem. Herod had kind of said, I don't know what you're talking about. You go find him and come tell me, and I can come worship him too, right? So they enter the house. Here's how you know they weren't in the manger, because they went in a house. So it took time. But guess what? I promise you, if on the way to the hospital you have a baby on the side of the road, you will have a place to stay that night. Okay? So the baby that was born in the manger, okay, was taken out of the manger probably the next day and put was taken to a place where they could take care of and be clean. Because the manger, y'all, this was probably a cave-like structure behind one of these public house kind of places. It's probably an indention in a hillside somewhere. And the manger that we build, that has the little cross legs and the nice clean hay in it, was probably some sort of box, right? That had dirty hay in it. And swaddling clothes is not an embroidered blanket. It's a bunch of strips of cloth that were somehow wrapped up to secure the child and give them that sort of. I was taught to swaddle Eli when he was born. You fold it and you fold it and you wrap it and you tuck it and the baby's all secure and closed up like that. I was taught that. Do what? A baby burrito. You're right. But here you go. How do you seek Jesus? Ecclesiastes 3:11 says He has set eternity in our hearts. God has created us in such a way that we recognize and have the ability to acknowledge that we're not complete. We lack something. There is something bigger than us. There is something big. Guess what? If we don't acknowledge that we are incomplete and that there's something bigger than us, then guess what? That person is the most prideful person you'll ever meet. Because that's the person that believes all of his existence is dependent on him, and he is the apex of his existence. So as God's creation, we have to acknowledge the fact that there is something bigger than us. Okay? Now, I think all the world wanders around trying to figure out what it is. And yet for some, God calls. God stretches out His hand and says, here I am. Now, who does he stretch his hand out to? I happen to be one of those. Now, this is where theology gets a little muddy, and I'm not going to get muddy with it. If you happen to fall into one of these schools of theology, fine, go. It doesn't make any difference to me. This is what I think happens. I think God reaches out to those. I think he calls and we seek him. We recognize that God is there, and he opens a path and a doorway for us to go, there you are. I mean, think about it. If I'm studying the stars in some Medo-Persian kingdom, city-state, something like that, and I go, something's happening in Jerusalem, boys. We ought to go. So you pack up to make a journey, right? See, I remember as a kid, I happen to be one of these folks that believe that, you know what, I could have rejected what my mother and father taught me. And yet my mom and dad introduced me to Jesus. And I embraced it to realize that somebody loves me more than mom and dad. And loves me so much that they sent Jesus into a stinky, smelly manger that he might grow up and die on a cross so that my sins could be forgiven and then rise from the dead and give his Spirit in such a way that my life could have purpose and meaning and I could be led all the days of my life. How do you seek Jesus? God calls. And we acknowledge and recognize that, guess what? Without God's call, and there's no purpose and meaning to this. You see, I mean, people try to create a legacy that I promise you will be forgotten. Right? I mean, who do we read about? You can go read about George Washington. But guess what? Just reading about him, you don't know him. You can read his biography. Right? You can read about, just name anybody that's historically written. Guess what? Guess how you know him? You know him because the person that wrote about him knew him or researched him, right? But you don't know him. And guess what? When you're gone, maybe your family will write your memoirs. But the people coming after you that you've never met are not going to know you. Okay? So when we start to look at this thing, you cannot create a world based on you. So there is a surrender involved. The idea that how do we seek Jesus? We seek Jesus because God makes himself known. There is what we refer to as general revelation. The idea that you look at the world we live in and recognize and understand that there is a design to this world. It works together. I remember 10th grade science class, y'all. We were studying photosynthesis. This would have been somewhere in the neighborhood of 1976 or 77. And I remember that in this, and I've told this story before, so I don't mind telling it again. It was a cartoon about photosynthesis. And there was this little scientist, he sort of looked like Colonel Sanders or something anyway, but he didn't have any hair right here, and he was just bald right here. And anyway, he was showing how the sun shines. And the plant has this green stuff in it that takes the sun. And then all of a sudden in that video, when I was in the 10th grade, the little scientist pulls the curtain. Because at that time, they didn't know how photosynthesis worked. And then about 5 years later, I am in organic chemistry, which I hated. And they began to explain how the carbon and the sunlight and the chlorophyll and all these things come together to produce oxygen. I breathe out carbon dioxide. The plants take it with some sunshine and make oxygen for me to breathe back in. Now, God did that. Okay? God made that. There is a design behind this creation. So that is general revelation. And then specific revelation is when God by His Spirit, whether it's in circumstance or some incredible manifestation of who God is, maybe in the stars or through your family or through the birth of a child or in some tragedy, the loss of a family member or a loved one, God reaches down and says, guess what? I love you. Specific revelation where God speaks to His kids and says, come here. Come to Bethlehem. Come to Jesus. That's specific revelation. So what do you do? What do you do when you find Jesus? Listen to the wise men. Entering the house, they saw the child with Mary, his mother. Now, so they didn't know Mary. They didn't know Joseph. They didn't know King. They probably knew of King David. They probably knew of King David's lineage, and they probably by that time had begun to understand the whole Bethlehem connection as the city of David, and they got there. But when they came in and here, can I just okay. Some people might find this offensive, and if you do, then you understand that just is how it comes out. The manger, when the shepherds got there, wasn't glowing. There was no sort of ethereal kind of glow going on. It was where the animals were cared for. Okay? Jesus wasn't glowing. He was a baby. Okay? God just made it evident that He was a special baby. Okay? All right? Now, I know what we see in the depictions, those kind of things. And maybe somehow you look at some people and they just have a glow about them. Maybe. I don't know. But when the wise men walked into this house, what they saw was a mom and a kid. And there's one on the back row back there. Now, everybody turn around and look at you. Sorry, anyway. It's a little boy, too. He's about 8 weeks old. He's a cutie pie. All right? It was a mom and a baby. Now, scholars who have researched this say that Jesus at this point might have been about 2 years old. Okay? We don't know. Why do we say 2 years old? Because guess what? Herod, when he found out that the wise men had left by, let's go ahead and say it, the wise men escaped Herod's kingdom. Because he had commanded them to come back and tell me where this baby is so I can go and worship him, when in his heart he was going to kill him. Right? But they escaped Herod's kingdom by another way. So what did Herod do? Herod went to Bethlehem and killed all the kids under 2 years old. So it kind of gives you the time frame there, under 2 years old. Okay? So Jesus, when the wise men finally got there, might have been about 2 years old. But Bethlehem, fulfillment of prophecy. Written in the stars, fulfillment of prophecy. Joseph, Mary, descendants of David, fulfillment of prophecy. Jesus born without a place to lay His head, fulfillment of prophecy. You ready? All of that. Great information. Thank you for it. What do you do when you find Jesus? You fall on your knees and you worship Him. You fall on your knees and you worship Him. Entering the house, they saw the child with Mary, His mother, falling to their knees. Folks, these are men who walked around their own community, their own kingdom, and garnered respect, right? Whether it was educationally, whether it was politically, they probably wore clothing. I don't know if it looked like what we see in manger scenes, but they probably wore some sort of vestments of their position. Now, we've been joking about John and Mary Lou's wedding. I have a robe, y'all. I not only have a sport coat, I also have a robe. And it has this velvet thing that runs around the collar and runs all the way down the front, right? And then I've got this little thing that you attach right here that's called a collar. And you throw it over your head, and it's got pretty colors in it, and the colors represent my degree, and they represent my field of study, right? And in that robe, I wore this last October for Halloween. And people came up and said, "What are you dressed as?" I said, "A real preacher." And yet all the kids came up to me and said, "You look like Harry Potter." Right? So the robe represents something, all right? I mean, those are things. So these wise men, these magi, these astrologers were educated. They were respected. They had garnered some sort of position in their community, right? And yet, when they walked into the presence of Jesus, they fell down on their knees. I used to would drop, but I won't now. But they would fall down on their knees and they worshiped. This word worship talks about pay homage, pay homage to. This idea of lowering themselves in order to elevate Jesus. Surrender, bow, obey. What to do when you find Jesus? You see? John the Baptist probably said it best when he said about Jesus, "He must increase, I must decrease." See, that's what Christmas is all about. I love the tree thing, even though some have explained what it represents. Anyway, I love the tree thing. I love the decorations. I'll go ahead and confess our tree didn't get decorated till yesterday. We put it up 2 weeks ago, and it was just a pretty tree in the dining area. But I put some stuff on it yesterday. And can I just go ahead and tell you, I began opening these crates, right, of Christmas decorations. And some of them have fallen apart and some of them have broken. But I remember pulling out the one that was baby's first Christmas. Not mine, Eli's. You know, I remember pulling out the one that Eli made here somewhere in one of the children's thing. And it was a picture of Eli when he had long blonde hair down to here, and he was about that big, right? And it's a little circular picture, and I think they stuck it in like a ball mason jar ring, you know, and tied a little string to it, right? I remember pulling out. All right, so we've got one that's because I went to school in New Orleans to seminary. We've got one that's this sort of movable alligator thing. The tail moves and the body moves, and we hang it on a tree, right? And I've got one because it's part of my favorite, and we buy Eli a brand new ornament every Christmas. And this one is Charlie Brown and Lucy, and it's a movable one with voices. And Lucy's there with the football. And Charlie Brown, it's a little motorized thing. You cock it back, and Charlie Brown comes running up, and she jerks the ball back, and he lands on his back. Ah! Folks, these are memories. These things mean something to me, right? And we build our own, call it tradition, call it, that celebration of Christmas. But folks, can I just go ahead and tell you that without Jesus, Christmas is nothing. I mean, you can pick a day in August to get your family together and exchange gifts if you want to. You can pick there is a song on the radio now. I don't know if y'all have heard it. It says, it's called Christmas. And it talks about how the world would rather we substitute the words happy holidays. And then in the song he asks, we don't do that in February. You don't get to Valentine's Day and go, happy holiday. You say happy Valentine's Day. I thought it was a cool song. I'm going to go look for it. But here's my point. What do you do when you find Jesus? You surrender, you bow, you obey. And Christmas is about Jesus. And it's the time of year when we celebrate His birth, His incarnation, His first advent. Okay? You see? I think it's really easy for the world to ignore Jesus. I think it's really easy for Christians to get caught up in the celebration of the world and forget Jesus. I just scheduled Friday the gathering in the Word for Christmas Day. And I started out, if you get the daily devotional thing, gathering in the Word, you'll see it says, let's keep it simple. Sometime today, you, with your family, with friends, read Luke chapter 2, verses 1 through 20. Read Luke's account of the birth of Jesus. Because without Jesus, Christmas is nothing. Okay? All right, so let's recap. You ready? Manger. Place to keep animals. A little stall, little hay bed, dirty. I've said this before. I don't mind saying it again. It probably stank. Okay? Manger where Jesus was born probably smelled bad. Okay? It was probably not the Hampton Inn with a storage shed out back. It was probably just a little old house where people were sleeping on benches and on the floor. Okay? Mary and Joseph, were poor. We know they were poor because the offering they made at the time of Jesus' circumcision was 2 doves. That was the poorest offering you could offer at the birth of a firstborn son. This was a poor young couple. Now, Joseph was probably a good bit older than Mary, but they were poor. And a wise man walked into the house and handed them a brick, a box, a chest of gold. Amazing, no? Another wise man walked up and handed them an incense that was incredibly valuable. Another one walked up and handed them a gum type thing. And these gifts that the wise men brought were representative of gifts for a king, presented to a poor couple and their firstborn child. Folks, it's an incredible story. But it's not meant to stay in the manger. The story of Jesus is about changing lives today. How do you worship Jesus? You give yourself to Him. Don't bring Him gold. Don't bring Him, even Micah says, would I be satisfied with thousands of rivers of oil and cattle? No, I just want you to walk humbly with God. See, give yourself to God. Pray with me. God, thank you for this day. Thank you, God, for the morning, the opportunity we have to hang out together and to celebrate. That's what we're here for. We're here to celebrate your love for us, your care in our lives. And God, I want to praise you for that. I want to thank you for the opportunity that we have to do this every Sunday. God, I want to thank you for the message of Christmas. But even beyond that, I want to thank you for the meaning of Christmas. I want to thank you that you loved us and that Jesus came, He died on a cross, and He rose again. So God, help us to celebrate that every day, not just Christmas time. Help us to celebrate that. God, help us to tell others about it. Help us to live it out. God, I want to thank you just for the privilege that you've given us to be this gathering. So God, if there's somebody this morning doesn't know Jesus, that's what we want to introduce them. If there are Christians here, people who know Jesus that don't live for Him, well, that's a conversation they need to have with you, God. And then there might be somebody here who wants to be a part of this gathering. God, a part of what you're doing here at this gathering. God, we always welcome folks to be a part of your kingdom in this place. So God, we thank you and we praise you for today. We pray it in Jesus' name. Amen.